Welcome to this podcast, which is organized by the Institute for Rediscovering Psychoanalysis. The title of the podcast is Bringing Psychoanalytic Theory to the Global South, a Neo-Colonialist Enterprise. We're pleased to be partnering with the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs, and specifically the gracious hosting of the program in Citizenship and Developmental Studies, and even more specifically, we appreciate Professor Darlene Miller, who leads the focus on engaged scholarship in that program. Now, my conversant in this podcast is not only such an accomplished man, but such a delightful man, and also a man who is prodigious in his productivity and in the impact he's had globally on thinking about a number of topics: Black existentialism, phenomenology, Africana, Judaic studies, Caribbean studies, the list goes on. So initially, I'm going to ask you, Professor Lewis Gordon, the Board of Trustees, Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at the University of Connecticut, but with so many career accomplishments behind him. Since I could give an introduction that would go on for 45 minutes, I'm going to ask him what he would like to tell you about himself before we begin the substantive conversation. Lewis.
Oh, so delightful to be sitting here with you, Barnaby. The first thing I'd love to say about myself, simply put, is I'm happy to be here. I love my family. And when I say family, I mean extended all the way through. It's funny when you go around the planet so many times, you begin to realize the whole world is your family and there are layers of love. I say this for a variety of reasons. Yes, I'm the Board of Trustees Distinguished Professor of Philosophy and Global Affairs at the University of Connecticut, and I had the philosophy department there, but I could mention that my work is also public in the sense of global, and that's why the global affairs part is there. And I'm also a musician, and for me, music is inseparable from thinking in life. But it's not only music, I'm also a chef. And one of the things is, for me, one of the most beautiful things to do is to cook, but not simply the making of the food, but the sharing, the joy, the conversation of what it is to sit down and just see people enjoy life, eating, and one another's company. So that's one of the ways I could mention things. One more thing. Even though I've published quite a number of works in a variety of areas, folks often ask, you do this, and that. And I said, no, they're all connected. And the simple connection is all of this is about the human being's relationship to reality, and something that some of the listeners may groove on. I also look at the many unfortunate ways we attempt to avoid it.
Yeah, that's beautifully stated. As I think the listeners will tell, Lewis is a considerable mensch. When I first heard him speak, he was speaking at, I think, the University of KZN several years ago. It was after you were for 2 years a Nelson Mandela professor, visiting professor at Rhodes. So it was after 2016. And Lewis integrated music and philological references into a very wonderfully broad and lively talk, which I can't even remember what the title of it was. Maybe you can, but I cannot. And this is very exemplary of him. He also presents in bare feet, which I want to mention, because there is something so grounded about this man, so not full of academic bullshit, which I can safely say since I'm no longer in academia. So let's actually begin having a conversation about what we're here to converse about. Psychoanalysis comes in many forms. it's actually quite an error to think of it as a single discipline. Right at this point in history, it's fragmented into several different things, several different entities, with quite divergent and sometimes contradictory assumptions about the nature of the human condition. But we're going to treat psychoanalysis not in terms of its method, because arguably you could say that a psychoanalytic method existed indigenously in African culture even before Freud. The method of listening to forces that impact us, that are beyond our consciousness, the method of trying to give them some meaning, some system of interpretation, which is very similar in many ways to the free associative process that I believe is the essential feature of psychoanalysis. But then there's the question of interpretation. And when we talk about importing psychoanalysis from its Eurocentric origins to the global South, I think we need to talk critically about the systems of interpretation. I'm very interested in the ways in which systems of thinking and ideologies change as they cross continents, and in this case, as they move, as in what I think could be described as a colonialist move from Europe into various cultures of the global South. But let us start, Lewis, with listening to you, because I know that you have very rich ideas about this. So I would like to know what you would like to tell psychoanalysts from your perspective about the processes of coloniality in systems of thinking and ideologies, and in the processes of decoloniality or decolonizing disciplines such as psychoanalysis, or in the process of what I'm calling neocolonialism, what I think is the questionable imposition of theoretical frameworks in cultures that they don't necessarily belong.
Well, that is a lot.
Well,
and it's a good lot.
I've already primed the listeners that you're capable of it.
Sure. Well, one of the things we could begin with is, when I said the human being's relationship to reality and some of our unfortunate ways of avoiding it, among those unfortunate ways is our relationships. I often wonder what happens when a discipline or a practice looks at itself. The technical word that's used for it is meta-theory, or the theory of the theory. It always struck me, what would happen if psychoanalysis psychoanalyzed psychoanalysis?
God forbid.
Right? But I do that with phenomenology too, right? What happens if there's a phenomenological critique of phenomenology, etc.? And those are the imminent critiques. That's when something tries to make itself more rigorous or stronger. I often compare that to a couple, right? There are couples who can have conflicts, and then they say, well, we got to talk about our relationship. And they may, but that working it out may strengthen the relationship, the imminent critique. But there is something else, right? Which is when we have the language of bringing something to, particularly in the context of Africa, it gets a little tricky because humanity began in Africa. So technically, a lot of things human come out of Africa. But what has happened with Euro-modern colonialism is to erase the out of Africa thesis and have that subordinated, and this is the colonial thesis, to going into Africa thesis. An organization I helped co-found was the Caribbean Philosophical Association. And in that, our first meeting was based on something I wrote, and it was called Shifting the Geography of Reason. We thought that would be the first meeting, but we realized you don't have a meeting and you shift the geography of reason. What we began to realize is that all the subsequent meetings were different dimensions of that project. So a geography of reason project that is colonial is the view that reason begins in the north and it comes to the south. So it takes the idea that disciplines begin in the north and they come to the south. But a lot of my work on disciplines point out that disciplines endanger themselves when they become insular. So even though the immanent critique is important, sometimes they become so insular that they forget they're not the world. When disciplines now remember they're not the world, but they're in a relationship with the world, They may learn from other disciplines, or they may even discover that somebody else may have been doing something in a different way, and so it becomes a co-learning practice. So if we move from bringing psychoanalysis into Africa to the question of how is it to engage psychoanalysis in the African context, one may discover that there's been a longer history, as you point out, of interpreting human phenomena or human struggles or human projects of healing or human projects of suffering that may require a more organic relationship in this context that could inform the other. I've often pointed out that I'm very much against rigid notions of binaries, okay? They often lead to false dilemmas. So it's a colonizer or colonized, all of that. I've not read a single instance of the people who are called colonizers who were not influenced by the people they colonized. John and Jean Komaroff have written beautifully on this, okay? But there are many others who have, Amilcar Cabral, etc. I just even repeated my point, you see? Now, the thing is, even a lot of the language we have, a lot of the theoretical language, one of the reasons I go through archaeolinguistics is all these surprises I have. Because I was initially trained in classics in the European sense, Greek, Latin, all of that stuff. I did philosophy, I did politics, I did physics, I did literature. But as I delve deeper, I've found that there's a more symbiotic, dynamic, complex relationship whenever people meet.
Can I just ask you to repeat the term you used? It was
archaeolinguistics.
Linguistics.
In other words,
yeah.
It's more radical than etymology. Etymology is when you're just trying to find the origin of the word. Whereas I'm more interested in, as you follow a word back, look at the wider sociality of its formation. In other words, there's one version that treats words as if they emerge in a vacuum. Whereas there's the more structuralist or community or dynamic-oriented way of trying to ask how do human communities build and what's the story behind how we build these forms of meaning. And what I've learned in a lot of that is that we're constantly influencing one another. So Freud is an example. It was striking how not only the question of the German language, but his knowledge of the Greek language and his interest to probe the past led to a more rich conception of the mythopoetics, right? And when I say poetics, I mean the affective elements that bring into living complexity, right? Ideas, concepts, and meaning. Well, within those, there's a lot of African already there in the language. And this is one of the controversies, of course, around Moses and monotheism and many other essays. So it struck me that if all around our species everywhere, there's certain basic things human beings are always struggling with and figuring out. For instance, human beings struggle with the question of meeting a stranger. Or we struggle with the question of realizing one day we won't be here. Or we struggle with what it is to be naked. You talked about my bare feet.
Which I didn't explain, but
but I
can leave the listeners hanging.
But it connects here, right?
Right.
When I go to speak, I go through a ritual. It's a ritual connected to me as a Jew, but it's also a ritual connected to me as a person in terms of Jewish ethics about what it is to have the responsibility for truth and for our relationship to the ethicality of communicating with others. So when I speak, particularly as a scholar or as an intellectual, I see myself as under an obligation to ancestors, the present, or what Alfred Schutz would call contemporaries or consociates, and the descendants, those to come. In other words, even though I will die before they're born, I see myself as accountable to them. Accountability requires going through something of making yourself bare. Well, bare feet which, especially in professional settings, already says that one is going to challenge and look carefully at why we conduct rules as we conduct them. But we also establish a sacred space of truth. One is grounded, touching the floor. One is at the same time vulnerable. And it's striking to watch a person who, especially when I'm in the beginning of my career, when I was what people would call a nobody, and now I'm the point in my career where there are people who would say they know what this person's name is, the idea of saying that one is going to make oneself vulnerable for critique is to say we can survive critique because we are also, every one of us in that moment, accountable. And it's striking, the strange sociality that's occasioned. And part of it connects to your work in an interesting way, because there is also the question of the groundedness, the touching floor, and the intimacy, the erotics of what it is to make oneself vulnerable in communicative practices with the other. So already there's a different relationship there, because it's clear I'm not speaking at my audience. We're there together, and I'm speaking with the audience. And also, if we want to put it to the self, something happens to us in our embodiment when we make ourselves vulnerable. We make ourselves in such a way that one has to let other things go. And this is an important thesis in many areas of self-critical thought. In phenomenology, when you let go of the natural attitude, it doesn't mean that you've abandoned the world. It's now you're beginning to focus on and face dimensions of the world that you may have dissociated or pushed aside. Well, similarly, as I see it in terms of psychoanalysis and other areas, not only it's like critical theory, whereas the context we met was in a critical theory meeting. That criticality is a relationship of self-criticality, but not as a thing, but as a relationship through which decisions are to be made. And every decision carries a responsibility. So the very decision of that vulnerability and semi-nakedness is saying right now that I'm not going to take myself so seriously that I fail to relate to what is bigger than myself. So it's also an act of humility.
You said a huge amount that we could pick up on. I think the groundedness in the earth and in the body is something, and in the eroticality of the body, using that word very broadly, is hugely important, and has, in the course of 13 decades, or at least the last 10 or 11 or 12 decades of psychoanalytic history, largely been lost. One of the results of that loss is that psychoanalysis comes to be seen purely in an epistemological light, that it's about knowing about something. It's about knowing about a foreign territory, the unconscious, the dark continent. And I use that word advisedly because in a way that is, it seems to me, the essence of the neo-colonialist project, the assumption that there is something out there which we have knowledge that we're going to impose or bring to in a quite power-ridden or patronizing manner, that we have knowledge that we're going to bring, and the other is going to learn it. And I think that this epistemological emphasis in psychoanalytic history has been a disaster, because in a way it's not about the interpretation, it's about what I call the ontoethical, sort of a term I slightly stole from Levinas, the ontoethical practice of opening up to dimensions of our being becoming that in a certain sense our knowing, our categorizing and our logic and our rationality close us down to. So this, it seems to me, concords, at least I think it concords, with your critique of phenomenology as having become too epistemologically interpreted. I think I'm right about that. But I wonder if you can address something about that, because what you say about relationality is wonderful, but there is a certain sort of power nexus in which knowing, interpreted as I know, therefore I have some sort of dominative relationship with that which I believe I'm knowing about. The expansion of that way of thinking has, I think, been quite detrimental, and to me seems very inherent in the way the Euro-modern era, the last 300 or 500 years of European epistemology, has been brought to the global south. Am I making a reasonable question for you to respond to?
Yes, you are.
Good.
I have to respond to it in layers, so I will proceed such. First, I'm delighted that you say Euro-modern. It's often, there are a lot of people who make the mistake of treating the European and the modern as isomorphic. There have been many moderns. All modernism is to belong to the present. And you belong to the present through anticipating a relationship with the future. But the way one articulates one's present can have profound ramifications. The Euro-modern, as opposed to many other kinds of modern, had at first an implication of distorting Christendom, which is what it grew out of, and the complex diversity of the world in the North. That led to a conception of being a European and being modern that carried a lot of baggage with it, that distorted the relationship not only to one another, but to the rest of humanity. It began to be governed by certain principles of purity, principles of knowledge as conquest. For instance, the idea if you meet as a knowledge producer, you go there as an agono or warrior knowledge person to beat up the others, stand triumphantly as the winner of knowledge. But of course, what everybody knows, that you can win a fight and be wrong. There are other models of how to produce knowledge, such as, for instance, not showing up as a schmuck and having a conversation and learning with one another. So the knower model versus the learner model. There's a complex process. Even when I talked about taking off my shoes, the humility practice is a practice of saying, even when I'm presenting what I've learned, the act of presenting it with others is a continued learning. And so the learning model is very different. Now, this is crucial because you see, the colonial knower imposition model says there's nothing for me to learn.
Right.
There's only for me to dictate. The neo-colonial model is, okay, even if I'm saying I'm going to let you be there. The thing is, I'm going to watch you to see if you're an analogical duplication of me. That is a neo-colonial model. Now, there's also, some people have this response where they say they're looking for decolonization. But Fanon was very astute when he said, decolonization is
Frantz Fanon.
Frantz Fanon.
Just to make sure.
Yeah, Frantz Fanon was very astute when he said, decolonization is just a replacing of one group of people with another.
Right.
The problem with that is it has a naive view of people because it treats people as if people can be who they are, independent of any other phenomenon. If people are relationships, then one has to transform the grammar of how relationships are produced. To make it plain, if you don't change the rules of the game or change the game, you're going to keep producing the same kind of people. So fine, you've replaced the colonizer with the colonized, but what you've really done is to create a new category of colonizers.
Right.
So there's another model that's needed, and the other model begins with the realization that we may have been working with I'm talking about the people who have inherited the colonial model, have been working with a set of false assumptions. One assumption is the idea that one can contain reality. Reality is always bigger than we are. The containment model in philosophical language is the ontological model. And you remember when you talk about the ontoethical? The moment you bring the ethical, you have something that transcends the ontological.
Of course.
The project from the ontological model is to subsume the ethical to the ontological. And that would work very well for a psychopath or a sociopath. But outside of that framework, one has to understand that one cannot contain everything unless you're a god, which is a profound level of narcissism. But one can relate to things in a very different way. And there's a philosopher by the name of Nishitani, right? Kaiji Nishitani, a Zen Buddhist philosopher from Japan, from the Kyoto school. He wrote a trenchant critique in a book called Religion and Nothingness. His critique was that what we call Euromodern thought is obsessed with ontology. We're obsessed with trying to make every aspect of reality into things. One of the first realizations we have, as I said realization, I didn't say thing, realization is that although we may look at what we call things, there's always more. Buber noticed this, Levinas noticed this, Nishitani noticed this, existential thinkers noticed this. And I would argue that despite his effort, some psychoanalysts' conception of science in terms of mechanism and a reductive materiality failed to see the insight of what is going on with an unconscious realm that is always exceeding grasp. That larger understanding of reality, not as things. So within that, once we realize decolonization by itself is not enough, now we have a very basic insight. There's a group who developed this view called coloniality. They say once you get rid of colonization, you now have a problem they call coloniality, which is that although you don't have a colonizer, you have the ongoing practices that led to your own subjugation. Because colonization would not have worked if it depended simply on material force. There's not enough material force to accomplish that. We're seeing it with the recent wars. We've seen it throughout history. Whether you talk about Ukraine, whether you're talking about Israel-Palestine, whether you're talking about Sudan, whether you could keep going. You could go through lots of history, whether you talk about the many wars from the 20th century, the 19th century, etc. And what that is the best way if one wants to subjugate a people is to let them believe in the legitimacy of their subjugation. Exactly. They'll do all the work for you.
Right.
So coloniality is to bring to our realization the practices we do that that produce our subjugation. Now, what many decolonial theorists don't do is to follow out the implications of that thought. In effect, that's saying, although a colonizer may step out, a new colonizer has stepped in. And that new colonizer is you, right? In other words, there's a form of colonization of oneself. Now, the thing about that model is it then leads in that kind of thought to an effort to decolonize. The opposite of coloniality is decoloniality, but it leads to practices of purification. This constant effort to say, have I cleansed myself of coloniality? The problem with that is that that leads to a notion of purification that increasingly turns you away from life, reality, etc. So I've often argued that this leads to a thing I call disciplinary decadence. Disciplinary decadence, the short version, is when a practitioner of a discipline treats the discipline as if it were created by God. As a consequence, the discipline becomes such that the practitioner fetishizes its methods. Because if a method is created by God, it's perfect. So why bother to look at reality? Just use the method and reality would follow.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this fetishization of method, of course, leads to such insularity that when a discipline meets another discipline, the response is to try to subsume the other discipline into one's discipline because one's methodological framework is complete. This is where you meet sociologists who say, yeah, but you're not sociological. Historians who say you're not historical. And it goes on and on. Philosophers who say you're not philosophical. So this is one of the reasons why early in my career, I did not start with the premise of what my disciplinary identity is. I want to learn about how to handle the problem in an actual conversation with those who are struggling with it. Now, this leads to a realization that there's no one discipline that incorporates all of reality. As a consequence, then, it's not simply about interdisciplinarity, speaking with another discipline.
Right.
It's about listening, communicating, and learning with other disciplines. And I call that transdisciplinarity.
Mm-hmm.
It's realizing that reality transcends our disciplines, but we can communicate with one another and new disciplines might emerge. It might be that one's discipline grows. Now, this means then that point I made earlier about psychoanalysis being self-critical, well, it may mean that within now the relationship to the global south, as an example, it would require a shifting of the geography of the understanding of how people meet in genuine communication.
Right.
So that means looking at the meta or the critical self-reflective level of psychoanalysis, a focus on a different question, which is what are we co-learning when psychoanalysis engages in conversations with others who have been engaged in a similar concern or set of concerns as psychoanalysts in one place, with practitioners or people interested in therapy or health or transformation, or just simply trying to figure out the affective life of connecting in other parts of the world. I would argue it means psychoanalysis grows, but it doesn't grow imperially. It grows in a way that is more life-affirming.
You've said a lot, and I would like to pick up on so many threads. Let me see if I can frame at least a couple of them, and I'm going to have to be self-disciplined because there are so many. I think the motivation for this podcast, in a way, is that I'm not convinced that psychoanalysis as a discipline is open to that co-learning. And one of the reasons not to be convinced of it, there's two reasons really that come to mind immediately. One is I wrote a paper, I think maybe 4 years ago now, about the way in which psychoanalysis institutionally, under the auspices of the International Psychoanalytic Association, was being brought to Asia. There are 6 Asian formally psychoanalytic institutes, and I was at a talk given by the president of the IPA, the International, in Taiwan, and I was appalled at the level of, we are bringing you the light, and you poor people should receive it gratefully because you've never thought of anything like this before. And I wrote a paper about that, trying to be more diplomatic in the paper than I am being now. So I'm not convinced that psychoanalysis in an organized sense is actually open to co-learning. What you said about ontological, I think, is very important, because there is right now a slight, tiny fashion, hopefully not more than a fashion, for seeing psychoanalysis ontologically as opposed to epistemologically, and there are a number of very notable thinkers, Michael Eigen, who's written about Jewish mysticism and psychoanalysis being one of them, who's starting to, under the influence of people like Bion and Winnicott, to think about psychoanalysis ontologically. You make the point that ontology has always been a sort of an attempt to contain it, which is why I'm keen on the term ontoethical, because for me, and this again is a bit under the influence of Levinas, ethical means an openness to what comes. It's nothing to do with morality. Ethicality is about an openness to being becoming. So I think that is a sort of an important point that I'm bouncing off things you've said that I think are hugely important. I almost chuckled out loud when you said about disciplinarity. Oh, the second reason, sorry, I lost my train of thought. The second reason I don't think psychoanalysis organizationally is open to co-learning is because it never has within its own ranks. You know, we have had splits and divisions, and they don't co-learn or learn from each other. They fight, and then they make some sort of a peace, as we saw with what in 1940 were called the controversial discussions between the Freudians and the Kleinians, which actually were a disaster. They went nowhere. There was no real, genuine intellectual connection or wish to co-learn, and there still isn't. If you look at self-psychologists and Lacanians and Kleinians and so on. And you said about disciplinarity, and you said how people try to characterize you. And I nearly chuckled out loud because it reminded me, I was going to interrupt you and be rude and say, well, Lewis, you just fall between the cracks. And then I remembered the line from the Leonard Cohen song, there is a crack in everything. It's how the light gets in.
It's how the light gets in.
Which I think you and I agree is a very important notion.
It's funny, as you said that.
Yeah, please.
Yesterday, well, there are two things I want to say. Yesterday, I was in a wonderful session in which my wife, Jane Anna Gordon, was speaking. She was speaking on statelessness and contemporary enslavement. But why I bring it up is the organizer asked us before we begin if someone could say a poem. But I also write poetry. I mean, I don't only write theoretical works, I write, artistic works and, fiction and plays, etc. So on the spot, I thought of a poem because I decided to write a poem in my head. So when it came, I said, I got a poem. It was a very short one, which is, don't fear the night because it reveals the beauty of the stars. Now, I think that connects in an important way with what you're saying, because you see that point you made about the epistemological. The idea is if the sun, I'll repeat it. The idea is that if the sun reveals all, you can see all.
Right.
But there are many things through which you can have an affective, wonderful relationship, like the wonder of the stars. Because that is not simply about knowing the stars. It's about relationship to that wonder, that beauty. Mm-hmm. That requires the night. This idea that you can have a false dilemma, day or night, choose one. No, the continuity and the relationships that are there, that's crucial. That's crucial. Now, the second part, even though I brought up disciplinary decadence, what I didn't bring up, and it relates to what you're saying, is first I'm going to say something that sounds very, what's the word? Cisquopedalic, which is in other ways fatuous. Is I argue that the response to disciplinary decadence is what I call a teleological suspension of disciplinarity.
Right.
Now, it's a nice academic sounding term.
And it's become almost an aphorism associated with you.
Yeah, but the short version is you need to be willing to go beyond your discipline for the sake of a healthy relationship with reality.
Absolutely.
The formulation is not of the teleological suspension is not from me. It's from Kierkegaard, Søren Kierkegaard. As you know, in Fear and Trembling, he talked about a teleological suspension, and people always translate it of the ethical. That's incorrect. It's of the moral, morality. And you're absolutely correct. The thing about, a lot of people don't know the distinction between ethics or ethicality and morality. Morality is more the rules, the conventions that bring a form of fixed intelligibility. But the leap beyond that carries a form of responsibility that reaches out to others, or if you're a person who thinks in terms of God, not God as a thing, but God as an ethical responsibility.
Right.
That is a core thing. So implicit, I saw Kierkegaard as having an insight that we normally have when we are willing. It's implicit in the act of learning. And it's implicit in the idea of not looking at reality as a thing, but looking at reality as something, as a relationship through which we are challenged with a question of what am I going to do? How am I going to relate to it? Kierkegaard said fear and trembling. I look at it in terms of the ethical responsibility issue as well. Now, within those, it struck me that what you brought up about psychoanalysis, your critique of what happens when it fails to be radical, when it collapses into orthodoxy, is about it becoming disciplinarily decadent.
Yes.
The question from there, of course, is for it to grow and to live, again, not as the discipline that explains all, but as a form of practice through which there can be new organic relationships developed in terms of how co-learning could occur. That means then, in a nutshell, now I could use my fancy-smancy language, it's clear I'm arguing that psychoanalysis needs a teleological suspension of psychoanalysis.
Yes.
It has to be willing to go beyond itself.
Exactly. But knowledge is domination. And it seems to me that very much is something that needs to be thought about as one brings, not psychoanalysis as a method, but psychoanalysis as a set of frameworks of interpretation into the global south. The second thing which you also touched on, although perhaps slightly more, no, you did not obliquely at all, but I mean, if you think about the ideology of the self as autonomous, completely contrary to Ubuntu or to any of it, or Buddhist philosophy of interconnectedness in the Mahayana tradition, and any of those things, but the idea that there can be mastery, which is really, I mean, you're laughing, but you would be...
No.
You, as far as I'm aware, you haven't done psychoanalytic training, and if you do psychoanalytic training, that idea of knowing and mastering is so embroidered in the fabric of how we train people in psychoanalysis, that, and it isn't seriously questioned. There isn't nearly enough serious psychoanalytic critique of psychoanalysis or psychoanalytic reflection on the discipline, and we see that in the disastrous politics that the discipline's already had. So the second thing, domination, subjugation, and domination as knowledge. The second thing, the idea of mastery, self-mastery, individuality, I think are very problematic. Now the third thing, which you actually sort of touch on, which I think is absolutely going to make or break the project of bringing psychoanalytic theories to the global south, is the issue of psychic energy. And you, when we had a meeting a few weeks ago, said something that I've been trying to reformulate and replicate. But there is the assumption that things are either material or immaterial. Now, Freud fell into this after 1915. He fell into that sort of, and it very much fits the medical model, the natural scientific model, the Euro-modern epistemological master discourse. And he believed that. He believed that psychic energy was endogenous, contained completely within the self, even though he confessed to a belief in telepathy, which seems to me entirely contrary. So Freud had lots of contradictions, and we mustn't idealize him. But the issue of psychic energy seems to me germane. Now, am I correct or not? Because I'm not trained in philosophy, but it seems to me that the assumption, this binarism that you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, that things are either material or immaterial, actually it's within that assumptive framework that psychoanalysis has been conceived and received, and it's why we have things like neuropsychoanalysis, which in some sense is a bit of a nonsense. And it's the assumption that still there's a Cartesian mind and a Cartesian body, and it gets us out of the body and into the mind, and all the things that characterize psychoanalytic history. But it seems to me psychic energy is an extremely important notion here, to the extent that, and Freud thought it was endogenous, which it clearly is not, but to the extent that psychic energy actually sabotages, it not only produces a reality that is way in excess of anything we can represent mentally, but it sabotages the whole idea of this binarism of the material and the immaterial. And you said it when we spoke a couple of weeks ago, and you phrased it far more beautifully than I've ever been able to, that those three things, the domination, subjugation, the notion of mastery and individualism, and the idea that psychic energy has to be expunged from the psychoanalytic vocabulary, which basically it was from 1915 onwards, as it got labeled as drive. But drive in psychoanalyst thinking becomes very much equated with biology. There's no room for a disjuncture between biology and drive or desire and mental representation. Have I so far picked up elements of what you said and picked them up in a way that's useful? Are there things that you'd like to modify or correct?
Oh no, you picked it up beautifully. In fact, another way of putting it, it's funny, my first book was on bad faith.
Yes, bad faith,
right.
And
bad faith.
And 1997.
No, 1995. It's 30th anniversary this year. Yeah, bad faith and
that
anti-black
was
racism.
2 years after your PhD at Yale.
That was, that's correct.
Yeah,
that's correct.
That book has had so much impact on so many people. I mean, it is sort of the thing that people mention after your name in terms of your prodigious publications. That, and I must mention this, the 2022 Fear of Black Consciousness.
That's correct.
And living in South Africa, I sometimes don't know about things that are going on in the rest of the world. But I was delighted that I came across that book a year after it had been published, and I hadn't heard of it, I hadn't read reviews or anything. I found it in an airport bookstore. Mm-hmm. Now that's where books like that need to be. Yeah. I interrupted you. Please
the funny thing is, the way many people at the time would talk about bad faith,
yes,
was still embedded in a certain philosophical anthropology.
It is a Sartrean notion, right?
Well, he talked about it.
Is it only Sartre?
No, it's not only he. There are others who have, even Nietzsche. But
yes.
But the thing is, and I think Nietzsche was very insightful with this. But the thing that I did in that book was to raise and expand the concept of evidence.
Yes.
When many people think about evidence, if you're locked in a narrow materialistic framework, you fail to see that embedded in the word evidence is the accountability of a relationship to a phenomenon in which it can be communicated with another.
Right.
Implicit in every notion of evidence.
And it's oculocentric. You have to be able to see it.
Correct. Implicit in every notion of evidence is the ethicality of the other. For instance, you could lie about evidence. That is to disclose it from another. So why this is important is the problematic philosophical anthropology that leads to mastery and domination and all of those other conceptions that you discussed. That leads to a connection to what I talked about earlier when I talked about the best way for people to be colonized is for them to believe the legitimacy of their colonization.
Right.
They must, in fact, believe a lie.
Right.
So I analyze these phenomena as forms of bad faith. Well, there's a lie about what a human being is.
Yes.
The lie on which the Euromodern world is premised is to pick a category of human being that ignores reality and sees everything in a materially instrumental, manipulative form. That's why sometimes it's not that I'm trying to insult certain audiences, but in some places where they really believe that's human nature, I have to explain two things through an appeal to evidence. The first one is what they're describing as human nature is a psychopath.
Right.
But the second thing I have to say, which is a little different, if that were really human nature, Homo sapiens would never have evolved. We are such fragile. How does a baby even survive in a world in which there's complete instrumentality? So, and not just us, and then I would raise with other hominins. So there's a wider question of how is it that we have come to believe something that in our everyday existence, the evidence contradicts that belief. You see?
Right.
The idea that for most human beings, the most cruel thing ever to condemn upon them is solitary confinement. The most, and in many parts of the world, it's striking how much just everyday greeting is an affirmation of what it is to be actually not alone and to say we're here together. Even the Isuzulu term, Sawubona, I see you. But in Hebrew, shalom, it's related to Shema. And which is in another way of saying, I hear you. And of course, cool, hip language from the 70s, I hear you, right? But it's a form of acknowledgement that affirms a form of dignity to our existence. So that other kind of, but that problematic way leads to another problem, a problematic conception of science.
Right.
Because many think it's how our science informs our philosophical anthropology. No, it's how our philosophical anthropology informs our science. Those architects of psychoanalysis were still locked in Newtonian science. One of from people like Bohr, Planck, and others on, what we understand is that it's not only the macro understanding of the world, but if you really are going to be serious about looking at the micro all the way through to the quantum understanding, the idea at a radically quantum level, there is so much infinitesimal reality. That other conception of mastery and control falls to pieces. You're in the realm of uncertainty. You cannot control everything. So these are all kinds of things going on that's very different. So the science that's going on, particularly in terms of, for instance, we talked about the body. There are people who make a mistake of thinking about the body in a purely corporeal form.
Yeah.
But the phenomenology of the body, the very existential question of the body, is more about the here through which there can be a there. Not a there as a thing, it's just that beyond here. But here was rather extraordinary, isn't it? You and I are speaking, where are we? We're here. But where's here? Well, when we were planning to meet, we said Pretoria. So even though you and I are here, Pretoria is here. Well, before then, I said, I'll be in South Africa. Well, there's a certain here where when we're thinking about the ecology of our planet, it's the entire planet. There's a here when we think about the possibility of the Milky Way. So there's this here. And something I could add, there are two books I'm working on. One of them is called Here, H-E-R-E. A lot of people don't realize how profound the implications of here is. And the obvious logical next one is there. Because implicit in every there is a here. Well, within that framework, this expansive framework, this gets to that metaphysical point you were saying. Because you see, some people not only work with a very reductive, materialistic notion of reality, through which they reduce every possibility to a thing, but there are those who try to constrain even metaphysics to ontology.
Right.
Metaphysics is greater than ontology, and this is one of the things that make it first awesome, but also for the person who wants complete control, frightening.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
I think there's a lot we could say, and it would take a lot of time, but I would encourage listeners, if they're curious, there's a wonderful essay by Merleau-Ponty, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, called The Metaphysical in Man.
Yes.
It's a beautiful essay.
It's fantastic.
It's an absolute beautiful essay, and it would give a lot of insight into what it is to be dealing both with what you see within your reach, while simultaneously realizing that there's so much beyond, not only in terms of description, but also in terms of many multifaceted ways of relating to the world, which is, for instance, the affective elements, the joy elements, the complexities of love. There are those, for instance, when I talk about, say, even research, a lot of people, when I say I'm talking about research, they think I'm going to go to something epistemological. And I often say, no. I see research.
Where's your data?
Right. I see research as actually, and a researcher as someone who's fallen in love. And it always shocks them. And that's a person who's fallen in love so much with learning. Not to conquer it, right? But fall in love with learning to the point where that person wants to learn from others. And if there's not another immediately there, teach themselves in such a way that it is almost like daydreaming, playing with the possibility of others for the practice and the joy of learning to continue. Well, this joy of learning, I call it a form of love. Because if we think about what, right, there's colonial conceptions of love, which is the analogical conception of love, which is, I love you because I love me, so I just see you as a projection of myself.
And what you do for me.
Correct. But there's another kind of love, right? There's the other kind of love where the idea is not for you to be me, but the celebration and the joy of not only learning together, and for instance, in good relationships, even when there's conflict, it makes the relationship stronger because you're discovering, not in the sense of unpacking, but you're beginning to set up a set of commitments that you would like to have. And so implicit in every act of researching and learning is also an ethicality of commitments that continue. And we find those could be such that what you always know when you do this, and this is the part where we're dealing with something sublime and powerful, which is you realize it can never be complete. There's a fundamental incompleteness. So it's about the commitment for the joy of the ongoing practice. We all know the people we love will not be here forever. It's a judgment that we wish they could be here forever, but we know they won't be. But we're saying the journey is still worth having because of the joy of that other.
There's so much here. So much here. It makes me so much of what you say, your critique of instrumental rationality, which is so woven into almost every psychoanalytic candidate's education. The idea, for instance, that there's such a thing as psychoanalytic technique. The whole history of the word technique from the Greeks on has been suborned with a certain sort of instrumental rational instrumental reason, in Max Horkheimer's words, the very thing that you're critiquing, way of being and looking in the world, and the demand for evidence and so forth, and all the baggage that comes with that. It's very sad to think, for me, working in a discipline, I'll use the word because discipline also means a commitment to a certain sort of conduct. Working in a discipline called psychoanalysis that I treasure, that I love doing on a week-by-week, patient-by-patient basis, and that has, in a personal way, probably saved my life. But loving psychoanalysis as a discipline, it makes me realize how much, your talk and the things that I've been thinking about and writing about for some years makes me realize how much of psychoanalysis, sadly, has its head up a cul-de-sac. And that's really a shame, but we're doing this podcast under the aegis of the Institute for Rediscovering Psychoanalysis, and I just hope that more people could listen to the sorts of things you've said today.
Well, thank you.
I really need to thank Professor Lewis so profoundly for taking his time to have this conversation.
Well,
Thank
thank
you.
you, Barnaby.
Thank you.